Hello and welcome to ThinkFest conversation with between myself, Khurram Husain, Karachi-based business and economic journalist, and Dr. Shashi Tharoor. We're very pleased to have him here with us. Dr. Shashi Tharoor needs no introduction, but I'll provide one nonetheless. He is a third-term member of Parliament, and where he also chairs or has chaired the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. He's got a long and distinguished career in diplomacy and international affairs. He's also been the Minister of State for External Affairs in the past. Has worked in the United Nations for many, many, many years, including as Under Secretary General during Kofi Annan's time. He's the author of more books than I'm sure even he can count right now, and he holds a PhD from the Fletcher School in law and diplomacy. And in addition to that, Shashi is also well known as a very skillful debater and an all-round very smart guy. So Shashi, thanks very much for joining us here today.
Thank you for that introduction, Khurram.
Well, thanks for being here. Really pleased to have you here. And I was just looking at the numbers for coronavirus spread in India. And I'm a bit alarmed. India is now the topmost country in the world. I believe there are 19,000, more than 19,000 new infections recorded just today. And the second on the list has less than somewhere between 5 and 6,000. So what's going on? How are things doing over there?
Obviously not very well, I'm afraid, Khurram. We look with envy across the border because you chaps seem to be having a rather pleasant time of it in terms of being able to return to normality. We are still facing many places where the numbers are going up, so there's no sense yet of a peak having been reached. And in some parts, including both the capital, Delhi, where I am now, and my constituency of Thiruvananthapuram in the extreme south, the numbers are worse than they've ever been. So we are worried. Partly, of course, there is a feeling that the more you test, the more you will find. And therefore, as the testing has been ramped up considerably, we are identifying more and more people infected. And I don't know how many people or what percentage of the population you've been able to test in Pakistan. But this seems a virus where a significantly large number of people who get the infection don't show any symptoms. And therefore, no one bothers to test them. And as a result, we don't realize how many more have been infected. So it's possible that a lot of people in Pakistan may have had it or even may have it now and are just not being counted because they're asymptomatic. In India, because the reach of testing is...
The key here would actually be the fatality rates, right? Because you're right that there would be a large number of asymptomatic carriers here in Pakistan too. But just wondering why the fatality rates are not matching the infection.
Well, the fatality rates are... Sorry, finish.
Even in India, the fatality rates I'm seeing about less than half of what they are in the world average.
That's true.
Here in Pakistan.
No, in fact, Khurram, I think you're right about that in the sense that throughout the subcontinent, including Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, it does look as if very, very few people, touch wood, are actually passing away because of this virus. But the problem is that the lethality of the virus seems to be completely random, in that people who are old and have comorbidities are surviving or getting very mild versions of the virus, and young, fit people are mysteriously passing away from COVID. So the problem is no one has fully understood yet exactly how this virus works and what it is in some people's bodies that makes them more receptive to the worst aspects of it or more responsive. I mean, there have been talks about all of this cytokine storm and bradykinin storm and so on. There are various theories that the body generates, and sometimes a healthy body can overwhelm itself by generating this response to the virus. All of this is yet to be studied. I think anything that you and I can say today would really be in the realm of speculation. But broadly speaking, there have been some factors that many have talked about for the South Asian subcontinent. One is the fact that all of us take the BCG vaccine as kids. Actually, I was born in London, so I never got it, but my sisters and my sons, I mean, anybody born in India has had the BCG vaccine. And that apparently may have conferred a certain degree of immunity, and that all of us in South Asia are exposed to so many viruses, so many sources of infection, that our overall immunity levels are maybe higher than those of the mollycoddled West. And that theory is plausible because of one anecdote that I came across, that between Portugal and Spain, two neighboring countries in the Iberian Peninsula, the vast difference in their infection rates and their fatality rates can only be explained by the fact that in Portugal, they continue administering the BCG vaccine, whereas Spain, like other developed countries in Europe, gave it up 40 years ago, 30 odd years ago. So I don't know. These are all
there are other countries that are showing similar divergences. For example, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Now, both are on the same island, both have a border, and yet in Haiti, the fatalities are very low. In the Dominican Republic, they are well above the world average. They're trying to figure out, maybe that makes for a good case study. But in any case, tell me about how are the political fortunes of the government in India being impacted by the rising numbers? I can tell you over here in Pakistan, the declining numbers, the government are recharging the government's political capital to a significant extent. And they are, they're running with the message that our measures have been effective in curbing the COVID threat, and to some extent they're even saying that we did it, we succeeded, we won against COVID. How is the government over there dealing?
Actually, it's paradoxical that the government in India is not doing well, and people realize they're not doing well in terms of managing COVID. But the polls suggest that it's not hurt them politically as it should. So we in the opposition do point out that, for example, the Congress leader Rahul Gandhi had mentioned as early as February that COVID had to be taken more serious, and the government was taking it, and that preventive measures had to be put in place immediately. Otherwise, we would face both a health disaster and an economic catastrophe if this were allowed to run unchecked. So he ought to be getting credit for having signaled this early on, much earlier than anyone else in India. Whereas the government was not only complacent, the following month they invited President Trump for a grand reception in Ahmedabad and brought him to Delhi and made a huge fuss about him with lots of crowds lining the streets. All of the stuff that you're not supposed to do if you want to prevent contagion. And yet, curiously, the polls show Mr. Modi still riding very high. So I would agree with you, there is a contrast between the way in which the COVID numbers have worked out in these two countries, yours and mine, but the fate of the leadership has not gone in the same contrasting way. Both seem to be doing rather well in the public eye, which to some of us in the opposition in India is still a bit of a mystery, but I don't want to discuss that outside India. We'll fight our battles at home.
Okay. Let me, in which case, zoom out a little bit. Let's zoom out in the conversation, talk about how COVID may have changed some of the trajectories that were already at play around the world before the arrival of the pandemic. And possibly the most important, and we can disagree on this, but we can say maybe one of the most important of the trajectories that was at play in our time, or that is at play in our time, is the rise and emergence of China as a great power on the world stage. This is not a trajectory that's a few years old, it's at least a few decades old, and probably has a few decades more to go before it reaches its what would you call it, moment of resolution or a clarity perhaps. But has COVID, in your view, how has it impacted this trajectory? Has it deflected China off its path towards emerging great power status? Has it somewhat delayed the process? I was surprised to see yesterday the Chinese were celebrating their victory against COVID, while in the United States on the very same day, the president was reeling from a series of disclosures from Bob Woodward that he may have known about the dangers of COVID and deliberately understated them. So we see two very contrasting pictures on the same day of two great powers, one celebrating its triumph against the virus, another one sort of grappling and wrestling with its political impact. How do you see this playing out?
You're so right, Khurram, because the fact is that there is a contrast. China actually itself had a very curious experience on all of this, because what they did, as you may remember at the beginning, was to be and feel extremely vulnerable. They were embarrassed in the first quarter of the year because they were being denounced around the world as a country that had incubated COVID and unleashed it on the world. There was open talk about decoupling from China. There was hostility to the way in which China had allegedly intimidated the WHO and prevented it from revealing how bad things were and so on. And China was actually in disgrace internationally for the first few months of the year. And they were actually trying to overcompensate through checkbook diplomacy. They were sending aid out, for example, when the virus hit Europe. The Chinese were rushing out in anxiety to demonstrate they were actually good guys. They were sending medicines and nurses and doctors to Italy and Spain and Serbia and so on. It was almost as if they felt they were in the doghouse and they needed to earn brownie points. That's all changed. In fact, it's changed quite dramatically, because what has happened is they seem to have turned around and said that why are we being apologetic and defensive? We've handled COVID effectively in our own country. We've actually, by our very strict measures in Wuhan, we've contained it. We have actually limited the amount of numbers, at least in terms of their publicly released numbers. We can strategically position ourselves as a guarantor of global public goods. And we can embark on what they now call wolf warrior diplomacy to assert ourselves in the world. And I think what's striking about that is that they've actually acted on it with a certain amount of vigor. And in fact, I would say even more than vigor. If you look at what's happened during the whole virus pandemic period in China's conduct, they've tightened their grip over Hong Kong, effectively ending Hong Kong's semi-autonomous status. They've increased tensions in their own backyard by mounting maritime patrols near the Japanese Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. They've sent vessels off the coasts of Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. They've redoubled their extensive claims based on their preposterous 9-dash line in the South China Sea. They've conducted aerial reconnaissance near Taiwan. They've unleashed trade sanctions and economic pressure on Australia, imposed 80% tariffs on Australian barley, all because Australia had the temerity to ask for an inquiry into the origins of the virus. They've even conducted cyber attacks against Australian government and business servers, and they've even sentenced an Australian man to death. They've deployed military force in their border dispute with Bhutan. They've cracked down on the Muslim Uyghur minority in Xinjiang. They've abruptly ended the so-called golden era of relations with the UK over that country's stance on Hong Kong. And they have essentially lashed out at India over the so-called line of actual control, where for the first time, remember, since 1976, no shot had been fired in anger, even on the disputed India-China border, because both sides had been able to keep things more or less on the back burner. Now you've had 20 Indian Jawans dying and an unknown number of Chinese, because they haven't revealed any numbers. And 2 days ago, India said that Chinese soldiers had fired shots for the first time in 46 years. So what's going on? I mean, it seems to me that we are seeing a much more assertive, India would say aggressive China, and that they're basically saying, listen, guys, the gloves are off. You do what you like. You insult us as a country that gave you coronavirus. We don't care. We're going to show that we are who we are. In fact, from an Indian point of view, it was amusing. We used to console ourselves with Deng Xiaoping's famous statement to Rajiv Gandhi in 1988 that don't, ever lose sight. He said that the 21st century will be India's and China's century. You can be sure that Xi Jinping will never say that, because his team and he himself clearly see the 21st century as China's century alone. And India is really a bit clear.
Let me stop you there for a moment, okay? Because this is, your rendition of the fact of, all these facts is a bit disconsonant with how the view looks from over here, from Pakistan.
Well, I'm sure.
Chinese power, the reality of Chinese power. When you go to Tehran, you go to Iran, where they've just signed an even larger trade and investment deal with China. And the perception is that China is one power now in the world that is still willing to acquire long-term stakes, that is still willing to finance the building of infrastructure in countries like Pakistan. but many others besides Pakistan. So over here, the perception is in fact one of a benign and a China that's seeking partnerships, and their own rhetoric of a community of shared destiny rings a lot more, shall we say, truthfully over here than it perhaps does over there.
Khurram, that actually was a narrative we also bought into, because we bought into the peaceful rise theory. But as far as India is concerned, the peaceful rise ended on the snowy heights of Galwan on the 5th of June when they killed 20 of our Jawans. And there's been no sign of it. For example, the instinctive reaction of India was to try and negotiate an end to this crisis of the Chinese suddenly moving forward to positions they had never occupied in the last, frankly, 60 years since the war of 62, to get them to withdraw. In fact, the 20 soldiers died because they had gone unarmed to ask these chaps, hey, aren't you withdrawing? What's happened? And they instead got killed. So from the Indian point of view, what we're seeing is a difference of kind. The peaceful rise, as far as we're concerned, is not going on. Now, I see your point about benign investment in infrastructure and development. But where India has always been a bit wary of CPEC and the other BRI, Belt and Road initiatives, is precisely our perception that this constitutes a debt trap in the making. Our next door neighbor, Sri Lanka, has already found this out because, as you well know, with the famous case of the Hambantota port, the debt servicing obligations were so immense that Sri Lanka ended up essentially handing over the port on a 99-year lease, saying to China, we can't afford to give you money every year, so you take the port itself that you built. Now, we ask ourselves, for example, with our Australian siblings across the border in Pakistan, what about the $60 billion that are being sunk into the CPEC? Are you going to be able to afford to pay for the debt servicing of all that the way the Sri Lankans are discovering they can't?
Shashi, let's come to that in a minute. But before we do, I just want to rewind a little bit to what you were saying about the shots that were fired in the in the heights in Ladakh on the 5th of June. The thing is, about a few years ago,
5th of June, there were no shots. It was much cruder. It was clubs and halberds and whatever. But the shots were last weekend, apparently.
The shots were last weekend, but the scuffling that began on the 5th of June and ended with shots being fired last weekend. But a few years ago...
I hope it's ended. I I don't know if it has ended.
Well,
it may be just the next
I think
next
every peace-loving citizen of South Asia would agree with you on that. But a few years ago, we were seeing a very different situation emerging. Back in the heydays of CPEC, for example, 2014, 2015, whenever the Chinese officialdom came to Pakistan to speak, excuse me, they also emphasized the regional aspects of CPEC. So if you look at Xi Jinping's address to the Pakistani parliament during his visit over here, during which all of the key term sheets were signed and CPEC was formally kicked off. He spent 1/3 of that speech talking about the higher than the highest mountain sort of rhetoric. He spent another 1/3 of the speech describing the projects that they will be undertaking. But about roughly the last 1/3 of the speech is about the regional aspects of CPEC. And there was a constant invitation from the Chinese to the Indians, come and join CPEC. They even offered to change the name, if you remember that briefing by the Chinese ambassador in Delhi at the Observer Research Foundation that became quite, famous over here as well. And then in 2018, we saw perhaps some reciprocation coming from the Indian side. We saw the appointment of Vijay Gokhale as Secretary External Affairs, and then there was a number of other, the cancellation of the Thank You India rallies that the Dalai Lama holds in India staying silent over the Chinese adventures in Mauritius. A number of other such steps in 2018, summer of 2018, right before August 2018.
Correct.
What happened? How did we go from there, where India and China were exchanging warm vibes with each other, to here, where India and China are now, exchanging blows on
Khurram, from our point of view, it continued beyond the summer of 2018, right up to early 2020, because in fact, Modi and Xi met twice more. They met actually a stunning 18 times in the last 9 years. What am I saying? 18 times the two of them have met. And in those 9 years, Modi was both Chief Minister of Gujarat to begin with and subsequently Prime Minister for the last 6, and they keep meeting. And Modi even hailed a new era of global cooperation with China and so on and so forth, as recently as when they met in Mahabalipuram, which was, I think, less than 7 months ago. So you're talking about a relationship that India actually thought was going in the direction you mentioned. What is more, India, under this government, had lifted some of the restrictions that even my notoriously liberal government had placed on Chinese involvement in the Indian economy. For example, we still had restrictions on Chinese involvement in sensitive sectors like ports and telecoms. Modi lifted those. So this was a government, the Modi government was absolutely willing to play ball with the Chinese along the lines you said. We couldn't possibly have got along with CPEC because it runs through a territory that we claim you are an illegal occupation of. After all, the state of Jammu and Kashmir acceded to India. Your chaps control 1/3 of it, and the CPEC highway runs right through that. So it's an insult to India's sovereignty to accept that reality. We can never join CPEC. But we had gone along with China on various other things. And indeed, our trade was mounting every year. We have reached over $80 billion. In fact, close to 90 and heading for 100 by 2021, had the course continued in that way. Chinese investments in our, I think there was an estimate I saw that some 9 or 10 of our top dozen unicorns have greater or lesser amounts of Chinese investment. So we were actually essentially accepting the very analysis you just mentioned. Khurram, we were going in together. And don't forget that India had applauded and joined the Chinese on a couple of multilateral initiatives they were leading: the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the BRICS New Development Bank, which, as you know, is in Shanghai with an Indian head, and which India and China contribute equally to. So apart from BRI for the important issue of sovereignty, we were working with China. So our concern is, why did the Chinese conduct this offensive across the LAC? Why were they willing to consider India so dispensable that despite India going
those being the questions, what are the best answers available in Delhi or with you as to why that happened? How did all of that momentum suddenly give way to what we're seeing today? I mean, right now, I believe the meeting is underway in Moscow, right?
That's right. That's right. Well, my foreign minister actually stopped in Tehran, since you mentioned Iran. He stopped in Tehran, had a couple of very good meetings with my friend, the Iranian foreign minister, Javed Zarif, before going on to Moscow. So I'm sure that these conversations will advance the dialogue in a constructive way. But I do want to say that as far as India is concerned, there was a sense of shock. I mean, the BJP government, which has been quite contemptuous of poor Mr. Nehru for being taken by surprise by the Chinese attacks of '62, have been equally taken by surprise by the Chinese attacks of May and June 2020. And I think it's simply that the Chinese, for whatever reason, decided that it was more important for them to gain some territory across the LAC than to preserve the kind of relationship with India that they'd been having until now. I mean, it's to us a matter of some concern.
That sounds a bit bizarre, though, doesn't it, Shashi? I mean, everything we know about the Chinese, the decision making within China, I mean, that would be a very irrational thing. Take all of the things you just mentioned, the trade and investment. Take all of they're cognizant of this. We know that because they've been talking about it for years. Long before, in fact, Xi Jinping, was it Deng Xiaoping, I believe, who had come to India and described India and China as two pagodas. So, I mean, over the decades, they've been sort of courting India very carefully. But to suddenly things turn like this, might India's actions in Kashmir have had something to do with this? And Amit Shah standing up in Parliament and laying claim to Aksai Chin and saying that Jammu and Kashmir, but also Aksai Chin is our territory. But the other party says, well, if you want to start unilaterally redrawing the map, then so will we.
It is possible, and your guess is as good as mine as to what motivated it. What surprises me is that if China had been persuaded by the logic of India-China relations, they would have actually said, listen, we've got more riding at stake than a silly remark for domestic consumption inside the Indian parliament. Let's avoid. But what gives credence to the worries about an overall assertive China is the pattern of all those other incidents I mentioned to you and the other patterns of behavior, which involved a dozen other countries and not just us. So why is it that so many countries are now suddenly alarmed? I mean, Australia, for example, has been a friend of China's. China is its most important trading partner. In fact, they had a Mandarin-speaking prime minister for some years, and they've really been going out of their way to please China. Why on earth is China behaving so belligerently with Australia? So I think there is something that's happened in China that has impelled them to flex their own muscles in quite a dramatic way. And it is a bit alarming. Now, what's happened is in India, of course, everyone has woken up. We've now said, my gosh, why were we allowing trade to grow so much when it's so completely one-sided? The bilateral trade deficit is about $55 billion. Why have we failed to notice that the cheap import of manufactured goods from China has been wiping out our industrial base? Why should we allow them to come and make major inroads into our tech sector when they're actually accumulating data of Indian users into their artificial intelligence bases? Suddenly, the Chinese mistake, and I would call it a mistake, in going too far on the LAC has actually, I think, cost them a bit. I mean, there was a direct cost in something as trivial seeming as India deciding to ban a number of Chinese apps, because I'm told that the parent company of TikTok, ByteDance, had took a $6 billion hit with that decision by the government of India. But now it's getting much worse. Huawei was the leader in the 5G trials rollout in India. They're going to be almost certainly denied the possibility of continuing their involvement. There's another Chinese company that was competing with Huawei for the ZTE. I think they will also face a serious problem. And, you know, I have argued for the Chinese, we are looking at them as a major player, but for them, we are a small player. We're only 2% of their exports. If pride and arrogance and assertiveness is the name of the game in Beijing, then 2% will not matter to them. They'll dispense with the 2%. And I think that what's really happened is that some people in Beijing have decided that it's time to show India its place, even if its place is in a hostile camp, which I think is unfortunate because of all our old romantic ideas about two Asian civilizations, which had actually had amicable relationships for millennia, being able to have a modern relationship today. But clearly the Chinese are not interested in that.
Shashi, what do you see as India's options if the post-COVID world is going to see an increasingly confident and assertive China? India in the past has been traditionally a non-aligned country. Traditionally, its foreign policy has eschewed entering alliances with others and has preferred to build, I suppose, partnerships would be a better word to describe the kind of relationship India has sought to build. But today it seems like India is being pulled perhaps into a set of relationships with countries like the United States, Australia, that are driven by their apprehension of China and its emerging and rising power. Do you think India needs to now shed the baggage of its history?
Well, look, I think we have a couple of options. One option is essentially to swallow the humiliation and go back to business as usual. But I think in a democracy, that's not a viable option. I don't think the Indian public, the Indian parliament, public opinion, the media will stand for that. So now there's a choice between two variations of a more tough posture vis-a-vis China. One is to absolutely insist on the restoration of the status quo ante as of April 2020, which would mean a Chinese withdrawal that China is showing no intention of doing. The Chinese have actually pitched themselves, not just with tents, they're building enduring structures, they're moving in equipment, they're building roads. It doesn't look like they're going to withdraw or move away at all. And so if that diplomatic demand of withdrawal doesn't work, I think India would essentially have to find itself both militarizing the border and this particular conflict in a fairly serious way, such as, for example, occupying bits of the LAC in order to have something to swap with the Chinese. Just as the Chinese have occupied bits of territory they never had before, we may have to say, listen, guys, if you want to sit there, we're going to sit here. And so there seems to have been some move on the weekend of 29-30 August of India taking some positions which were theoretically areas where both countries used to patrol, just as the Chinese in April, May took positions that both countries used to patrol up to then. So if the Chinese started this crisis would withdraw, I'm sure India would withdraw too, and that could diffuse it, but the level of mistrust that has arisen will not easily dissipate. There is a group, there is a faction, if you like, in the foreign policy establishment here, and I forgot to correct you. I'm no longer chairman of the External Affairs Committee of Parliament. I did that for 5 years. I now chair a different committee, the Information Technology Committee. But on the BJP chose to take the leadership of the External Affairs Committee for itself, first in our independent history, but that's a different story. But still, let me say that the foreign policy establishment does have a faction that says now we should stop worrying about strategic autonomy, which was the hallowed term of art in India for our own ability to make our own foreign policy decisions and determine our own postures in the world. We should instead look very seriously at enhancing cooperation with the Americans, or the American-led camp, if you want. They're not talking of alliance yet, so to that degree, they're still non-aligned. But what they're saying is, why can't we, for example, strengthen our partnerships with the Quad of the India, Japan, America, Australia cooperative group, which for the first time met at foreign minister level in the margins of the UN General Assembly last September. India had been very slow in moving that forward precisely because of its feelings for China. They had only allowed it to meet at mid-level officials. But suddenly foreign ministers met, and now it looks like they're looking at the option of creating, through the annual Malabar naval exercise, which India conducts with Japan and America. Now they're getting Australia to join, and that'll give us a formal practical platform that adds a military dimension to the relationship. Interestingly enough, just to finish with that, interestingly enough, India is not the kind of country that will ever go into a kind of updated 21st century version of CETO, which Pakistan was a part of. I don't see India ever signing up to a defense pact or an alliance. But I can see more cooperation, more exchange of information, more exercises. And one interesting development that has been coming through in some of the specialized journals on the subject is increased intelligence cooperation. We've heard that, there's an Anglophile intelligence sharing alliance called the Five Eyes, which is made up of the Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, Brits, and Americans. So the 5 classic Anglophone countries. Japan has essentially joined them in an exercise of cooperation in defense intelligence sharing. They amended their law to permit them to do that. And now there's serious talk that India and maybe Australia might come along. I'm sorry, Australia is already in it, I beg your pardon. India might join Japan in a sort of new Seven Eyes forum, which could transform security in the Indo-Pacific. And whatever they may say about the Indo-Pacific, the entire concept will be seen by Beijing as targeting China's interests. Now, as I said, there are still 2 variants of this. Let me just finish that thought and I'll come back to your comment. The 2 variants are, one is to go along with the American campaign of containment. I am very hesitant, and I would argue that many Indians would be hesitant to do that because we've historically been allergic to alliances and feel no desire to put all our strategic eggs in one basket. For example, we're still very heavily dependent on Russian military equipment and supplies, even though we've diversified our military purchases. Why would we want to write that off by joining an American-led grouping that the Russians are bound to oppose an alliance with the Chinese? But what we could do, I would argue, and in fact I have argued in a short piece in the Indian media, is instead of containment, we could think seriously of constraining. Now, I don't mean by constraining just 2 different letters of the alphabet, containing and constraining. What I'm talking about is a policy that says, whereas containing is kind of hostile and says we will block the Chinese, we will oppose the Chinese, constraining says we'll continue engaging the Chinese, both bilaterally and multilaterally, but we'll try and manage them by leveraging our friendships to limit how much China can do to harm our interests. So we're not going to thwart the Chinese, we're not going to weaken the Chinese, we're not going to oppose the Chinese, we won't join an alliance against the Chinese, but we will actually use our diplomatic, geopolitical, military leverage to manage and limit Beijing's ambitions. That will constrain, in a way, how much it can get away with. That's the concept, and it's a question of it's a defensive approach as opposed to containment, which is a more hostile and aggressive approach. I'll pause there because you were about to say something and I continued over your voice.
I was going to say, If we just sort of zoom out a little bit, we began this conversation by talking about the inexorable nature of the emergence of China as a great power. It would seem like India, if constraining is going to be some kind of a strategic objective, is up against a lot. It's up against quite possibly a historic force that's rising in our midst. Nobody knows at this point where exactly China's emergence and rise is going to plateau out. Will they emerge ultimately into superpowerdom or not? Those remain unanswered questions. My question is that given India's long border with China, given India's baggage, historical baggage, granted it's not as intense as the historical baggage that China's eastern neighbors have. China and India may have some things to argue about from history. Nothing approaches or nothing close to what China and Japan have, for example. But nevertheless, it's there. How much do you think these distant powers can really do eventually in the long run? I mean, eventually the fact that India shares a long border, has some history with China, has a great deal to gain from building some kind of a cooperative relationship with them. But ultimately in its own neighborhood is standing alone facing this power. One after another other country.
Not entirely. I mean, first of all, I think China has made a historic mistake. And I say this not just as an Indian or about India, but about the way in which the world has seen Chinese behavior over the last 6 months. I think that the peaceful rise was a great strategy because it set for the Chinese an absolutely benign narrative. Their Confucius institutes are proliferating around the globe. They were just being seen as a purveyor of cheap goods, reliable supply chains and production chains. That was the sort of image that China had, manufacturer for the world. If it continued like that, God knows how far they could have gone. Now I find that with their behavior of the last 6 months, people are questioning the true cost of that $5 t-shirt that they're buying in America. There is a mounting aversion to the made in China label, and that's not just Trumpian rhetoric. I think there is a real concern that when one's hearing, for example, about a desire to boycott Chinese-made products and so on. Many corporations, not just American and Japanese corporations, but those two in the forefront, have said we have to diversify away from China. We have to de-risk our supply chains. There will be additional costs, but that's a cost of doing business, because if you want resilience, you want continuity, you want safety, security, you don't want to be vulnerable to Chinese machinations, you can't afford to be completely committed there. And I think that one of the things that coronavirus has shown the world is you just can't afford to keep depending on China like this. For example, the US suddenly woke up to the realization that 100% of the ibuprofen sold in the United States originates in China. 45% of the penicillin sold in the US comes from China. They're discovering that their dependence on Chinese pharmaceuticals and even the ingredients to make pharmaceuticals means that China can essentially turn off the supply of medicines to America whenever it likes. And they're desperately now overcompensating by trying to create these methods closer to home. And frankly, India and many other countries are feeling the same way. So I think there's a genuine issue here about China. But if like you, I can zoom out even further, I have a bigger set of concerns, Khurram, about the post-COVID world, which even goes beyond China, which is that there is, I think, the onset of an era of de-globalisation happening in which more and more countries are going to embrace isolationism and protectionism in ways they wouldn't have done without coronavirus. See, the pandemic has confirmed for many that in times of crisis, people rely on their governments to shield them, that global supply chains are vulnerable to disruption and are therefore unsustainable. As I mentioned earlier about pharmaceuticals, dependence on foreign countries for essential items can be fatal. Now, there's a rush to reset global supply chains and raise trade barriers. There's a demand for more protectionism and self-reliance, including in India. Countries want to bring manufacturing and production value chains back home, or at least closer to home as much as they can. And so lots of things that we took for granted in the era of globalization are suddenly imperiled. The global flow of capital and investments, multi-border pipelines, energy grids, free and easy international travel, which we've already seen disappearing in the last 6 months. Borderless Europe, we saw disappearing in the last 6 months. There is, it seems to me, an extraordinary transformation happening in the post-COVID world that is even larger than our current conversational obsession with China. The world goods trade is going to shrink about 30% this year, maybe more. The pressure to decouple from China has shown the Japanese, for example, setting aside $2.25 billion in incentives for Japanese companies who pull out of that country. Can you imagine? And if those who don't come to Japan but go to third countries like India or Vietnam, they're also being given money by the Japanese government. Equally for the rest of the world, and particularly for the developed world, where inexpensive Chinese labor and subsidized inputs meant an era of cheap goods, that era may be over. Now look what's happening politically. COVID-19 has convinced so many countries that foreigners are to be feared. Strict border and immigration controls are deemed essential now. Neighbors and allies are no longer trusted. Even in Europe, you saw that tremendous division between the so-called frugal four and those who are seeking a bailout from Europe. National interests, in other words, in every country are trumping international cooperation, and I use that verb advisedly. So many countries, and certainly in India, Mr. Modi is an exemplar of this, but we have Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, you can find 20 examples. The answer seems to lie in strong government, putting the nation's needs over individual citizens' freedoms, dispensing with democratic niceties. National interest is all. The government is the arbiter of that interest. Nationalist strongmen are gaining in power, in authority. And I suspect that that xenophobia, a fear of the other. I don't know how many of you have seen these WhatsApp videos of people who are Chinese or looking Chinese or of Chinese descent, suffering discrimination in various Western locations, supermarkets, being thrown out of supermarkets and restaurants because they look Chinese. In India, we've had a similar problem with our Northeastern citizens who do look a bit different. And we've seen the kind of bigotry and prejudice that some of us are fighting against in India arising again because of the pandemic. A Puritan Islamic sect, the Tablighi Jamaat, had held a major gathering just before the first lockdown in India, whose attendees spread the infection to many states when they returned home. And this was used to justify open bigotry and discrimination against Muslims. So the virus hasn't just given us, a healthcare scare. Yeah, it is odd. It's not just odd, it's contemptible. But the point is that we are looking at all sorts of other forces unleashed by the virus that I've just summarized for you in that rather long list, that I think will change the post-COVID world in a very unbenign way. That's my argument.
Okay, Shashi, I could speak for hours with you myself, but we have a very large audience here and we have some questions coming in. So let's give others a chance to enter the conversation as well. So here's Salman Ahmed, who writes, if the USSR and the US cooperate at the height of the Cold War on polio and smallpox, can Pakistan and India also cooperate on COVID and achieve a détente? So going a bit, swimming a bit against the current of what you were just saying, COVID fanning more atavistic sentiments. Can it also be?
Salman is a good friend. This is the Salman Ahmed of Junoon. I know it's him because he has actually corresponded directly with me on this issue. And I can tell you that I'm always inspired by Salman Ahmed's idealism. But the truth is that in the present climate between India and Pakistan, the level of mistrust is so high that even cooperation on something like the coronavirus pandemic, I think Salman specifically said that Pakistan, because of its positive experience, may have ideas, techniques, and best practices to offer. But I'm afraid in the present climate, where we are so restrictive in our dealings with each other, we're not playing bilateral cricket, we're not easily giving visas to each other, we don't even have a high commissioner in each other's embassies. In those circumstances, expecting that India would say, come Pakistan, give us advice on your best practices, I think is simply unrealistic. So I welcome Salman's idealism. I really hope and pray that one day we will get back to the brotherly relations that Jinnah Sahab had always said the two countries would have, but which we have never really been able to achieve except in brief spasms.
Okay, let's move ahead. There's a number of questions coming in now. So Saqib is asking, Bangladesh is now moving into the China orbit from India. What does Dr. Tharoor think of this?
Not entirely true. I think that there is certainly, Bangladesh has always had a certain sentiment of sympathy, shall we say, for India, and a certain sentiment of mistrust of India. You know, being a huge neighbor of smallish countries is an experience that no small country particularly welcomes. I'm often reminded when Indians ask me with surprise about, say, Nepalese negativism or Bangladeshi negativism or Sri Lankan. I say, you know, you should think of Porfirio Diaz, who was president of Mexico more than 100 years ago, and who said about that, he said, "My poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." I mean, the fact is that ultimately every small country has a complex about every big country, and certainly in the case of India in South Asia, even if you include Pakistan, and you put all the SAARC countries around the table, India will account for 70% of the population and 80% of the GDP. So naturally, there's going to be a certain resentment, mistrust, and I think equally India can't take a step without accidentally knocking over somebody else's teacup. That's part of the problem that a big country has. Having said this, Bangladesh has been very cooperative with India in recent years. By and large, under Sheikh Hasina, there's been a tremendous amount of sympathy. For example, for the first time, Bangladesh apprehended terrorists and militants inside Bangladeshi territory and handed them over to India, which has never happened in all the years of Bangladeshi independence. So there have been some very positive gestures. I would not agree with the questioner, Saqib, that Bangladesh has completely moved into the Chinese orbit. But certainly, if I were a Bangladeshi policymaker, I would also explore a counterweight. No country wants to be overly dependent on any other neighbor. So they will certainly play off both countries against each other. Classic non-aligned strategy. It was often said with Nasser that Egypt prospered because he would telephone the Russians and say, "If you don't give me this, I'll go to the Americans for it." And the next day he'd put the phone down and could call the Americans and say, "If you don't give me this, I'll go to the Russians for it." And Egypt prospered that way. And I think Bangladesh would be well advised to try the same thing.
Okay, well, let's continue with the questions. Like I said, I could speak with you for hours on the many things you've just said. So Sukhdev Sohail, he asks, if you were Shadow Foreign Minister of India, what would your policy be? May I just add to this? May I add to this? What would your policy be regarding how to deal with China's threat, and then also how to deal with Indo-Pak relations and how to build more trust?
Well, on Indo-Pak, because the truth is that I did chair the Foreign Affairs Committee, and therefore I've nailed my colors to the mast very clearly, in that I take principal responsibility as chairman for the report of the Standing Committee that was tabled in the Lok Sabha, the House of Parliament, and is therefore a public document. And invite Pakistani listeners to go on the website and find it, which basically argues that while after 26/11, the awful terrorist assault on Mumbai by terrorists established to have been sent, financed, trained, and even guided during the attack from Pakistan, while after that normal relationships became not just difficult but impossible, absent any punitive action against the perpetrators and their commanders from Pakistan, nonetheless, that the best way forward, if you had a vision for this, was increasing people-to-people relations and increasing trade relations. In fact, on the people-to-people front, I've always believed that every Pakistani I've ever met who's been to India has gone back from India absolutely wowed by their experience. And I might add the same with Indians who go to Pakistan. There is a tremendous amount of warmth and affinity between individuals of the two countries, and we should build on that to create a constituency for good relations on both sides. As for trade, about 7-8 years ago, there was an excellent study done by the Karachi Chamber of Commerce on the advantages of free trade with India, which completely demolished the argument made by a small coterie of Pakistani industrialists that trade with India would destroy them. With statistics and figures, please find that. I read it in a Pakistani journal about 7-8 years ago, arguing essentially that trade would actually be a win-win for both countries, but a bigger win. And the paper quantified it for Pakistani businesses. So that would be another way of cementing relationships. And if we did both of those things, more people-to-people contacts and more trade contacts, it seems to me we would be raising the threshold for another misadventure like 2611, let alone another war, because more Pakistanis would have more at stake in good relations with India and vice versa, and therefore the odds of conflict would decline. And I stand by that thesis. It obviously is not the current establishment view in India, but that would be my instinct. That I think that I certainly believe firmly in protecting India against any depredations coming from across the border. But at the same time, I believe that when I read the World Bank report that says that South Asia is the world's least integrated sub-region, I feel a bit of shame as an Indian that, we don't have the imagination, vision. We who have lived together for 5,000, 6,000, maybe 7,000 years, as more and more archaeological digs are establishing, if we can't live together now, then it's really a failure of the imagination on our parts, and we really ought to be able to get over our issues. I don't think that we can easily rely on the military to do that, on your side in particular, because I do believe that hostility with India is part of what keeps your military in its extraordinarily influential position in your society and your polity. There is no military of any country in the world that has a larger share of its country's budgets than the Pakistani military does of yours. So, I mean, you have a challenge as Pakistani civil society in carving out a non-military space for yourself. But I don't want to get this festival into trouble with the military in your side. Let me say on my side that where the civilians do call the shots, we really ought to look at easing up on these areas. And a number of reports that we have written, and particularly the major report on India-Pakistani relations, will be my answer to Sukhdev Sahel's question. So,
Shashi, you mentioned the case or the example of, you just invoked the example of Porfirio Diaz earlier. And one of the things that Porfirio Diaz's government was probably also very far away from was the problems and difficulties of its own people. And, among, I think, bigger than America, one of the biggest problems he faced was the Mexican Revolution. What do we make of a government in India? Because here in Pakistan, one of the strengths that the civil society over here draws upon is that people and the electorate continues to vote along pocketbook issues. The ideological vote is actually very small and has rarely, in fact, never really, carried the day. Has rarely really made much of a bump in electoral politics. But yet in India, you mentioned earlier yourself that like the curves are climbing. And somehow it doesn't seem to be denting, or there doesn't seem to be a wellspring of people trying to hold the government accountable for it. Even Donald Trump is hurting from the rising infections in America. But somehow, the rulers in India seem to be impervious to the travails of their own people.
You are saying this to a Congress Party MP. Who has to ruefully admit that our campaigning on the basis of the very simple message, this government has failed you economically. If you were promised a job 5 years ago and you voted for them, and 5 years later you still don't have a job, why would you vote for them again? If we said, why would you vote for a government that hasn't delivered the economic growth that it promised you? Why would you vote for a government that hasn't given you the prosperity that you were led to expect would be yours if you voted them into power the first time? We said all of that, and we still lost almost as badly as the first time.
Yeah.
The question that comes up is, why did the Indian voter vote not according to their pocketbook, but in other considerations? I'll leave that to the political scientists to figure out. But it's clear that some elements of identity politics, of national pride, and of national security, don't forget that just a month before the elections began, we had that awful bomb blast in Pulwama in Jammu and Kashmir, in which 40 Indian Jawans were killed. And immediately the government sort of thumped its chest and said, we are the ones who will give a fitting reply. And as you know, they bombed Balakot. With what effect is a different matter, but they did. And as a result, they were able to thump their chests across the electoral constituencies of North India. I am a candidate in South India, so I kind of miss the intensity of their appeal in that regard. And these things also made a difference. So an election is always a snapshot in time Khurram, I would argue that it's not necessarily proof that the people of India are indifferent to their own economic well-being. But at that particular time, they placed a number of other concerns ahead of the concern that we expected them to have on jobs, unemployment, economic distress, and so on. And so we think that if there were an election tomorrow, they're likely to vote against the BJP because of its mismanagement of COVID and its mishandling of the economy and the fact that we have the worst unemployment levels ever recorded in the history of Indian records and statistics. But having said that, who knows? When the election takes place, what other issues of identity, of security, of whatever else it might be will carry the day. That's the good thing and the frustrating thing about Indian elections and any democratic elections really, is that the people get to decide at a particular moment. And then what they decide holds good for 5 years. That's what goes on. And that's we all have to live with that.
Okay, let's get back to the questions. Naveed Khan asks us, could you please comment on the fate of multilateralism at the time when global coordination is so imperative to meet global issues? So yes, I mean, COVID is asking us to cooperate, and yet there are these forces pulling us apart.
Well, exactly, and that's the flip side of what I talked about: the increasing nationalism, isolationism, overemphasis on sovereignty, and so on that we've seen in the wake of this pandemic. Suggests to me that multilateralism is in deep trouble. The US had already withdrawn from UNESCO before the pandemic. Now it's withdrawn from the WHO, and that's no small thing because you're looking at a world in which the sort of de-globalisation I described will also extend to the capacity of global institutions, such as the ones the UN has set up and its bodies like the WHO, to deal with all these. Because, I mean, you can well imagine a Donald Trump type person in other countries saying what Trump has already said, which is what's the good of this international organization if it can't save us. In the case of the WHO, they say, oh, WHO was actually culpable in spreading COVID-19 because they ignored red flags from Taiwan. Since Taiwan is not a full member, they underplayed its seriousness because China told them what to. They provided blanket clean sheets to China because China essentially called the shots. So if these organizations are hurting the objectives of which they were founded, why support them? And he's just walked out. Israel and the US have walked out of UNESCO. What other bodies they're going to start questioning the value of? I worry. And then with the recession that seems to have started with the COVID pandemic, will they start looking for ways of economizing on their financial contributions to these bodies? I think it's a very worrying period. You're highlighting sovereignty, then sovereignty is more important to you than multilateralism. You are suffering xenophobia in your cultures and societies, and certainly in the US, that's rampant. Obviously, why would you want to work with a whole bunch of foreigners on issues that really matter to the well-being of your people? I expect a lot of rethinking and renegotiation of multilateralism, and I worry about it because I spent 29 years in the United Nations service, not as somebody seconded from the government of India, but as an individual in my own right. My only service in the government of India was after my 29 years in the UN. And I want to tell you that for me, there are some real worries about what this means for the world that I worked for 29 years. Because I genuinely believe that humanity did better if we could really appeal to what we have in common, what united us rather than what divided us. But in this pandemic period, I'm seeing much more emphasis on what divides us, and each country saying me first, America first, India first, whatever. And at a time when the US is not even showing any interest in giving leadership to the multilateral response. I forget its own bungled response at home to the pandemic, that there's a kind of loss of trust that any foreign country, including the US, can do anything for you. What price multilateralism in that kind of environment?
Okay. Hello, I hope I haven't lost the audio here.
I'm still here. Did you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay.
I think I can only take one more question, Khurram, because we are past the 8:30 mark. I know we began a bit late, so we went on a bit late, but...
Okay, well, just two more questions, if it's all right. Because one is
I've seen...
what you've already said.
Yes, I've seen the question from Gul Khan. Gul Khan says, will the post-COVID world see the rise of more authoritarianism and xenophobic tendencies? But I answered that. Perhaps the question was typed before I I came to that towards
But
the end of my conversation
I
with
think
you.
it was. But just a very quick thing, do you think that sort of thing is inevitable, or do you see countercurrents to this at play as well?
Well, I don't see the countercurrents yet because, you're looking at Hungary, you're looking at Turkey, you're looking at India, you're looking at the US, much more of this emphasis on tough, strong, decisive leadership, I beg your pardon, which is also divisive, but that's another matter. That's been happening in all of these countries. And it's very difficult to find a poster child. Maybe Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, a tiny country of 4 million people, would be the best example of a leader that went the other way, that said, let's all work together, let's explain things, let's be cooperative, etc. But she too did have to seal off her country from outside travelers and take some tough lockdown measures to prevent the virus spreading. And while I'm a great admirer of Jacinda Ardern's, I'm sure many of you in Pakistan will remember how she amazingly handled the aftermath of the awful Christchurch bombings, where we lost people of Indian and Pakistani origin, and how she had the courage, unlike what we've seen after similar incidents in America. Here she put a dupatta over her head and went to the mosque the next Friday, to show her solidarity with the victims. That kind of leader is still very unusual, and I don't know whether you can find a leader in a country of any size, let's say 100 million plus people, or a country of any economic weight, let's say 250, 300 billion GDP or above. Can you find a country with a leader that has taken that kind of Jacinda Ardern approach in facing and responding to this crisis? I think not. I think all of them have in fact tended to consolidate power. They've all. I think Hungary suspended parliament. Many courts have found themselves thwarted in their ability to look at these things. So more authoritarianism, more xenophobia has been visible. Can we push back? I, as an Indian, would hope that in my own country we can push back. And that our long democratic traditions of 73 years now cannot just be lightly tossed aside. But it's a long struggle. It's a tough struggle. And the struggle had begun to be effective when the coronavirus and the lockdown ended the protests around the country over our Citizenship Amendment Act. So I don't know. At the moment, I'd say the authoritarian xenophobic tendencies are not only on the ascendant, they're on the top. But the others still have, I hope, the idealistic convictions that will enable them to fight back.
Okay, well, I do believe we are now at the end of our time. So, Shashi, thank you very much for a very, very thoughtful and reflective conversation here. It's exactly the sort of thing we seek to do through the ThinkFest. And I wish there was a happier note we could leave people at on this. Even though the curves are flattening over here in Pakistan, there's an air of optimism that the tide of the pandemic has reversed. We're emerging onto the other side. But what kind of a world we will face on the other side is another very big question. So with that in mind, thanks again for your participation in this event. And I want to thank as well Yaqub Bangash for putting this event together and making this happen. And thanks to everybody who joined online.
My thanks to you, Khurram, and to Yaqub. We look forward to more opportunities for dialogue across the border. At least virtual life permits that more easily than other things. So thanks very much.
Absolutely. Amen.
Great to see you.
All the best.
All the best.